What happens when human architecture forgets its purpose? We build walls to protect ourselves from the elements, doors to define our boundaries, and lights to banish the dark. But when you strip away the function, leaving only infinite, repeating walls and the maddening drone of artificial light, space itself becomes a predator.
Welcome back to Dark Coping, where horror meets the mind. I'm Constance.
And I'm Maricat. Today we are examining the cinematic adaptation of The Backrooms.
This is not a conventional monster movie. This film is a psychological case study on isolation and the pathology of corporate negligence and what happens to the human mind when it is severed from reality. Using the concept of liminal spaces, Backrooms will explore trauma and survival in an environment that has no natural law. Think Severance meeting your own sleep paralysis hallucinations. Let's examine the evidence.
To understand the film, we have to look at the catalyst. The narrative centers on a secretive research institute in the late 1990s, attempting to solve spatial limitations by opening a threshold to alternate dimensions. In doing so, they inadvertently created no-clip zones, which are fractures in our reality where unsuspecting civilians fall through the floor of their everyday lives and into an infinite, non-Euclidean labyrinth of yellow wallpaper and damp carpet. As a preliminary assessment, this film is a brutal, unrelenting exercise in existential dread. It strips away the comforts of traditional horror tropes. For its meticulous commitment to atmosphere and psychological realism, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. If you have not yet viewed the film, log off now. We are crossing the threshold. From this point forward, all plot points, environmental hazards, and the psychological deterioration of the subjects will be analyzed in full detail.
Yeah, let's start with the perpetrators, the ASYNC researchers. What's chilling here is their absolute absence of malice. There's no evil monologue. There's only the clinical detachment of progress. So we see a pathology of institutional narcissism. And they've discovered they've displaced civilians into this void. Their primary concern isn't rescue, it's data collection.
Exactly. It mirrors real-world historical cases of unethical human experimentation. The researchers view the victims not as people in peril, but variables in a closed ecosystem. When the lead scientist reviews the VHS footage of a victim begging for help, he doesn't react to the emotional trauma. He takes notes on the acoustic properties of the room. It's this banality of evil translated into quantum physics.
Yeah. And this contrast amplifies the horror for the victims. The trauma of the lost isn't just that they're being hunted. It's the dawning realization that the people holding the key to the door are actively choosing to lock it and keep you in there. So when analyzing the lead researcher's behavioral profile, how do you categorize the complete lack of panic when the first civilian vanishes? I mean, is it shock or something more pathological?
I think it's textbook compartmentalization, both of extreme hubris. He immediately reframes a catastrophic ethical failure into an unforeseen variable. In his mind, acknowledging panic means acknowledging a loss of control, which shatters his God complex. By officially designating a missing human being as a data anomaly in his audio logs, he successfully insulates his own ego.
Yeah, it's the ultimate utilitarian defense mechanism, justifying the sacrifice of an innocent individual for the perceived advancement of the institution. So this brings up the physical infrastructure of ASYNC itself. When we look at the hazmat suits and the reinforced observation windows, do you believe that they serve as a psychological purpose beyond just biological quarantine?
Absolutely. They function as almost moral insulators. We are looking at a macro scale version of the Milgram obedience experiments. This observation glass creates a literal and ethical barrier that dehumanizes the subjects trapped inside the labyrinth. When the researchers look through the glass, they don't see a person suffering. They see like a lab rat in a maze or a specimen in a terrarium. This brings us to the survival aspect. The film treats the entities not as supernatural demons, but as biological anomalies, apex predators perfectly adapted to a sterile environment. The stalker psychology utilized by the entity in the third act is fascinating. It doesn't just chase, it herds.
Yeah, it uses acoustic mimicry. So we see it play the sound of a human weeping, crying to lure the protagonist deeper into the maze. This is a recognized predatory tactic in nature. But here it preys specifically on human empathy. The practical effects used to render these entities make them feel heavy and jagged and profoundly wrong. So there's a visceral, fleshy reality to them that contrasts violently with the artificiality of the office space.
And furthermore, the violence, when it occurs, is entirely unglamorous. There's no musical crescendo. When the secondary survivor is caught, the camera drops. We only hear the blunt, wet sounds of blunt force trauma echoing down a drywall corridor. By removing the cinematic score, the film forces the audiences to endure the reality of the violence as an unfiltered forensic event. It is deeply uncomfortable to witness. Looking closely at the entity's use of acoustic mimicry, specifically when it projects the sound of a weeping human to lure the protagonist, how would we classify this predatory behavior from a psychological standpoint?
Well, it is a highly evolved form of psychological warfare that targets the human pro-social instinct. You know, cats actually do this when they do that high-pitched meowing sound that sounds like birds chirping. It's because they're mimicking a bird's chirp, and the social response birds make to that sound draws them into their predator's realm, and they are prey. We are biologically hardwired as a species to investigate and assist when we hear distress. So it's a foundational element of human survival and community. So by mimicking vulnerability, the entity is weaponizing Clark's own empathy against him, Mary's own empathy against her. It transformed our greatest evolutionary strength, our altruism, into a fatal flaw.
I mean, it almost suggests that the entity isn't just hunting, it understands human psychology enough to exploit us from a moral level.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the actual violence. When the confrontation finally occurs, the director makes the deliberate choice to remove the musical score entirely. What is the clinical effect of presenting the violence with this level of acoustic austerity?
It removes the psychological safety net of cinema. You know, a traditional horror score acts as a mediator, and it tells the audience how to feel, reminds them that they're safely watching a constructed narrative. Our nightmares have no such thing. Our actual sleeping nightmares are leaving us feeling like we're there. We're existing inside of a real reality, a warped reality, but it feels real. By eliminating the music, the film forces us into the role of a forensic witness the same way. We're no longer entertained spectators. We're impotent bystanders watching unfiltered, found footage evidence of a fatal assault. Hearing only the hyper-realistic wet thud of blunt force trauma echoing down a drywall corridor shifts the experience from scary to profoundly traumatic.
It refuses to glamorize the subject's death without any of the background music that we're used to, that kind of like dark, ominous tones that give our minds the clue
removes
that
the
something is
psychological
going to
safety
happen or
net of
something
cinema.
is happening.
So, which leads us to the climax, if you can call it that. Traditional narratives demand catharsis. A monster is defeated or an escape is made, but Backrooms denies us this basic psychological comfort. The protagonist finally finds the threshold back to reality, so she thinks, only to discover the researchers have sealed it. It is a quarantine bulkhead.
The psychological weight of that final shot is devastating. It's a warped copy-like manifestation of Dr. Mary Klein, who is shown sitting by herself in a surreal, empty room as the environment replicates her inner trauma. She doesn't scream. The film insinuates that some trauma cannot be survived or overcome. It simply becomes the new reality you inhabit.
It's a metaphor for profound isolation. So once an individual crosses a certain threshold of trauma, the real world becomes inaccessible to them, like a dissociative state. The door to reality is closed. They're left to wander the yellow halls of their own fragmented psyche. And that's why Backrooms doesn't end with a death, but an eternity of wandering. And that's infinitely more terrifying. So when Dr. Klein locates the threshold back to what she thinks is reality, she doesn't find the rescue team. She finds a hermetically sealed quarantine bulkhead. Clinically speaking, what does this barrier represent?
I mean, I think it's the ultimate manifestation of an institutional betrayal. Throughout the film, Dr. Mary Klein operates under the delusion of a social contract, really. The belief that if you're lost, authorities will eventually look for you. The bulkhead shatters that contract entirely. It proves that the ASYNC researchers recognize the extreme danger of the anomaly, yet they prioritize the contamination of their own world over the salvation of the individual. The door isn't sealed to keep the entities out. It's sealed to trap the liability
it's a sterile,
within.
bureaucratic death sentence. So in the case studies we analyze here on Dark Coping, cinematic trauma is always framed as a temporary state, a monster to be vanquished so the survivor can return to normal life. But how does this climax dismantle that trope?
I mean, I think it dismantles it by presenting trauma not as an event, but almost as like a permanent geography. The traditional cinematic survivor returns home altered, but they do usually return. The backroom almost gives us something much darker, a more realistic truth about severe psychological damage. Some traumatic events are so completely devastating that they permanently sever your connection to the world of the living. The victims aren't just trapped in a yellow hallway. They're exiled to the architecture of their own shattered psyche.
Yeah. The film argues that true unhealed trauma has no exit. It's an endless inescapable space that you just have to inhabit forever.
The Backrooms is an exhausting clinical exploration of abandonment. It takes the internet's collective fear of liminal spaces and grounds it in a grim institutional reality. It demands endurance from its audience. Because it commits so fearlessly to this bleakness, my final assessment remains at a 3 out of 5. It is structurally brilliant, though a very slow-paced watch.
My 4 out of 5 stands. This film is a mirror held up to the alienation of modern life using modern artistry. Just like how we spend our lives in sterile, artificially lit boxes like cubicles and waiting rooms and hallways, this film asks, what if you could never leave? It strips away human connection and leaves only the architecture. I think that's a masterpiece of psychological erosion. So we leave you with this question for the case files. What do you find more terrifying? A hostile entity actively trying to destroy you? Or an infinite empty space that is entirely indifferent to your existence? Leave your thoughts in the comments.
Thank you guys for joining us for this analysis. Next week, we're going to try to be dissecting 2 films. The Undertone, which is currently streaming on HBO Max, as well as Eli Roth's new film that just hit theaters last week, The Ice Cream Man. Subscribe so you don't miss it. If there is a horror movie you would like to see us discuss, leave your recommendations in the comments.
Until then, keep an eye on the exits.
This is Dark Coping. Keep surviving the dark.